Historically, we've become accustomed to the idea that big guys are bad shooters. This is compounded by the countless examples of big guys who struggle at the free throw line, like DeAndre Jordan, Andre Drummond, Dwight Howard, and even Shaq. But in recent years, the increasing prevalence of big men who can stretch the floor with their three-point shooting has become a topic of conversation, and old-school basketball fans can often be heard lamenting the loss of the post game in the face of the modern stretch 4 and even stretch 5. So, in this video, I'm going to go on an exploration into how height affects shooting to see if any conclusions can be made about the changing role of the NBA big man and his relationship with the three-point shot. The answer as to why big men have traditionally not been elite shooters might seem obvious to some of you. The taller you get, the less naturally coordinated you get on average. This would make a lot of sense, and I'm sure most of you know that one tall, lanky friend who doesn't seem to be in control of their limbs quite in the same way that you are. If we plot the entire NBA on a graph by height and free throw percentage, there is a definite correlation, with height being inversely proportional to free throw percentage. It's very hard to imagine what it's like to be 7 feet tall. Often, people try to imitate this feeling by lowering the rim to make it easier to dunk. But this modification is an oversimplification of the situation for taller players. Because you're essentially scaling the court down in size by lowering the rim, to truly imitate the 7-foot feeling, you'd also have to decrease the size of the ball and the radius of the rim itself. Obviously, this isn't something that people can practically do because no one makes rims that are, say, 6/7 of the standard radius. But this is the scale that you'd have to achieve if you were 6 feet tall and you were trying to capture what it felt like to be 7 feet tall. Say, to imitate a free throw, instead of standing 15 feet away, you'd have to stand 12.9 feet away. The rim would also only be 8.6 feet off the ground instead of 10 feet. Both these things would make it easier to shoot consistently, but the rim itself would only be 15.4 inches in diameter instead of 18 inches, and the ball itself would be smaller, at 8.2 inches in diameter instead of 9.6 inches. The significantly smaller rim will be a lot harder to fit the ball through, akin to throwing a ping pong ball into a cup, albeit not quite at that scale. These examples, of course, lie on a spectrum, with the larger hoop at one end and the smaller hoop at the other. This issue of scale is a major reason why, the taller you get, the harder it gets to shoot, and I hope that this has helped you to imagine what it feels like to be a big guy at the free throw line or the three-point line. Despite all this, the rising prevalence of incredibly skilled near 7-footers and even 7-footers like Kristaps Porzingis, Joel Embiid, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Kevin Durant to name a few, all of whom have range that extends beyond the three-point line, should complicate the basic notion of tall equals uncoordinated. In fact, the whole NBA is, in many ways, proof that rare and exceptional height is not a necessary barrier to ball skills, as we see many abnormally tall humans performing moves that we could only dream of pulling off. I think this development is, contrary to what you might hear on TV from analysts like Shaq and Charles Barkley, a sign of the increase in talent necessary to dominate as a big man in today's NBA. Think about it like this. Here is a graph of the US population arranged by height. As you can see, the most common height is 5'9", which is the average height in the population. If you're below 6 feet tall, you're competing with all the other basketball players in your general height range to be good enough to play point guard in the NBA. There are a limited number of positions on NBA teams, and because you're competing with so many people at this height range, you have to be a truly exceptional athlete with every possible trait to make you stand out from the millions of other individuals in your height range trying to play professional basketball. This is why the shortest players in the NBA are always the most skilled. They have to display elite shooting, dribbling, speed, quickness, vertical leaping ability, and passing vision. If you don't have all these traits, then you can be damn sure that one of the other million sub-6 foot point guards in the world will, and that player is going to be the one who takes your place on the roster. Moving to the far end of the spectrum, if you're over 7 feet tall, all of a sudden, the size of the competition has shrunk dramatically, simply because there are so few of you who exist. Instead of having, say, about 90 roster spots for millions of people, there are now only 90 roster spots for a few thousand individuals. Immediately, this reduces the selection pressures placed on you. If you can only run, jump, and rebound, then that might still be enough to get you on one of these roster spots, because it's pretty likely that there isn't someone who can replace you with more value for an NBA team. This relative lack of competition is a major reason why, up until recently, there have been so many big men who can't shoot from beyond 10 feet away from the hoop. So, how do we explain the sudden increase in shooting big men who display just as much touch and feel for the ball in terms of shooting skill as many 6-foot-tall point guards? The answer is, of course, NBA schemes, and the rise of the terms spacing and gravity, which simply refer to how much or little your defender can help off of you for fear of having to leave you open for a jump shot. This demand from teams, inspired by the simple mathematical truth that shooting a decent percentage from 3, say 40%, yields a higher point per possession result than shooting the standard percentage from anywhere else on the floor, has added a new selection pressure to the pool of 7-foot people who play basketball. NBA general managers and scouts are now saying, "Oh, so you can run, jump, and rebound. That's great, but we have 10 other guys who can do the same thing." To distinguish yourself as a near 7-footer, you now are more likely to have to display an ability to stretch the floor. This is the same reality that smaller players have been facing for a long time, and it's simply catching up to taller players. This increased pressure to add range is the reason why we're seeing elite shooters emerge at the 7-foot positions, because as you increase the minimum requirement of a certain ability, you're also more likely to see more exceptional examples of that ability. That's what shooters like Steph Curry and Trae Young are now. They're simply exceptional examples of an ever-increasing demand for shooting ability, but in the guard category. Of course, it's worth noting that near 7-footers with world-class leaping ability, like DeAndre Jordan or Andre Drummond, can still survive without shooting ability. But those players are increasingly becoming the exception to the rule. Using this logic of increasing expectations leading to increasing ability, I don't think it's unrealistic to expect a 7-foot Steph Curry to come into the NBA in the next decade. We've already seen guys like Porzingis and Lauri Markennen break records for 7-foot three-point shooting, so why should we put a limit on our expectations for the future? Finally, because I'm big into shooting technique, I'd of course like to talk about shooting technique in this video. It's one thing to point to the trend of increasingly skilled 7-foot shooters in the NBA, but it's something else entirely to explain how these players are able to shoot so effectively. A huge factor has to be practice. When future 7-footers are growing up now, their idols will be Porzingis and Dirk Nowitzki and other players like them. This means that when those players go out to practice, they will of course be more likely to practice three-point shooting than kids growing up 20 years ago who might have idolized Shaq's low-post power game. But while practice is undeniably important, I think it's worth noting that we're seeing a trend in the techniques of young elite near 7-foot shooters like Kristaps Porzingis, Karl-Anthony Towns, Lauri Markennen, DeMarcus Cousins, Anthony Davis, Joel Embiid, Al Horford, Kevin Love, Marc Gasol, Pau Gasol, Brook Lopez, and Kevin Durant. All these players are utilizing the basic technique methods that I promote here on this channel, namely early release timing relative to the jump, a small jump height, and a relatively low set point. These techniques allow these players to harness their strength and control their releases to maintain consistency and reduce variation in the final result of their shots. I promise you that even if Shaq had practiced as many threes as Porzingis has in his life so far, Shaq wouldn't even come close to being the shooter that Porzingis is today because his shooting technique is horrible. I've talked ad nauseum about how these techniques can be beneficial for smaller players and taller players in my previous technique breakdowns, and I encourage you to check those out on this channel if you haven't already. Finally, I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you want to show your support for my channel, then hit subscribe, and follow my new Instagram, which I've left at the top of the description box below.